Can you see the sharing?
ROTHMAN.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, as Monty Python said, and now for something very different. Shengavit was an important small center from 2850 to 2500 BC. This is within the Toronto Workshop KA2 period. Although no architectural remains can be assigned to the early Kurgan period, there is some evidence that people of the early Kurgan visited the site, dug storage pits and some graves into it, and presumably lived there for some short stretches of time in temporary housing that left few archaeological remains. Researchers, such as the paper we just heard, claim that the tombs of the early Kurgan period existed at Shengavit. Whether that is so or not, we will discuss later. But certainly it is true that Shengavit existed as a place of importance in the memory of these people after the site was largely abandoned. Also, no significant hiatus existed between the Kura-Araxes and the early Kurgan period. And no evidence exists of any occupation after the early Kurgan Badeni Montkopi period. The site of Shengavit sits on the southwest edge of the Koitak Plateau overlooking the Ararat Valley along one of two northern to south running rivers, the Rajdan. Its environment is one of dry steppe with cold winters and hot summers. At 800 meters above sea level compared to Yerot at 2100, only 75 kilometers away, and sites in the Araxes Basin at closer to 600 meters above sea level. The environment is one rich in pasture and in areas of rainfall agriculture. The floodplain at the foot of the Shengavit mound must have provided productive agricultural land, as our palynological reports from Eliseo Kvavatse and Anahit Ayotan suggest. There was potential for intensification through irrigation. Shengavit was first excavated in the 1930s. To quote by Bortian, quote, in 1935, the quarry workers in search of road fill excavated 3 areas. All of a sudden, in one of the diggings, the workers came across a stone wall, which they destroyed. In the back dirt, there were a lot of broken pottery and several fragments of clay hearths. The rumor reached the museum workers, and in the spring of 1936, the city place was observed and once again registered by them as an ancient city type of Shresh Lur type. Taking into consideration the scientific significance of the study of a city site of this type, the Department of Preservation and Monuments decided to carry out trial excavations, which began on June 14th, 1936. Bybortian was the head of the expeditions of the Committee for the Preservation of Historical Monuments. In 2 seasons' work spanning 1936 to 1938, Bybortian determined that it was a prehistoric site with a culture he called Shengavitian, what we now call Kura-Araxes. His field notes and a sample of his finds are housed at the National History Museum. His dissertation in Russian was published by the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in 2011. For the 1930s, Bybortian was an extraordinary archaeologist. His field reports give ample detail of what he was seeing, to the point of assigning artifacts to particular rooms. However, he did not fully understand the stratigraphy of this tightly packed site, writing at one point how odd it was to put stones on top of walls. The Soviets decided to build a hospital in part over Bybortian's excavation squares, and other legal and illegal constructions have reduced the probable 6 hectares of the original site to about 2.5 hectares of archaeological remains. In 1958, Sandro Sardarian, so you can see that's the Sardarians, the green here, began excavations again. He and his son continued this work until 1964, and again from 1965 to 1983, using the site to train students of archaeology. Sandro Sardarian's strength was as a synthesizer, and his work have covered a wide range of archaeological cultures in Armenia. He did not keep detailed notes, so we really cannot reconstruct stratigraphy or plans for the sites for each architectural level. The off-illustrated picture of the Soviet reconstruction of architecture probably never existed contemporaneously. Further, a guard at the little museum at the site who dug with him told us that Sardarian only kept big or beautiful potsherds and other artifacts, so we do not have a full sample of what he unearthed. Since 2000, the expedition of the Historical and Cultural Heritage Scientific Research Center headed by Hakob SIMONYAN, continued the study of the site. The excavation began in 2000 with a re-excavation and expansion of one of Sardarian's trenches near the small museum to determine whether Sardarian's 3 phases fit the actual stratigraphy. SIMONYAN also worked in squares K5, KL34, L, and in the necropolis beyond the wall and down the western side of the mound slope. 2009, I joined SIMONYAN. My goal was finally to publish the remains of the site. Few Kura-Araxes sites in all of the South Caucasus have received full publication to a modern standard. Without that, progress on understanding this important ancient cultural tradition and societal type is not possible. To clarify the stratigraphy and have a detailed high-resolution sample, we dug for 3 seasons. SIMONYAN has continued with 2 short seasons in 20 and 21 to clarify the nature of the M5 ritual emplacement, and this past month on the settlement wall. Mikhail Gevorgian and Rafi Duragian of the Geophysics Department of Yerevan State conducted a georadar survey. Oops, am I 2 or 3? Okay. We dug 1 square, K6, from the top soil to the bedrock on which the site was founded. This is the square we will focus on today. It was 3.5 meters deep. Bybortian 2 reached bedrock at the same depth, and the georadar showed the same depth for bedrock at various spots across the still open parts of the northern third of the site nearest Lake Yerevan. The latest evidence of prehistoric activity we call stratum 0. It is defined only by pits cut into the underlying strata. No one has found architectural remains associated with it, although I wonder about some square rooms Sardarian drew, which appear to differ from the circular building he writes about in his 1967 and 2005 books. Are these remains of early Kurgan date? I do not know how we could possibly find out without good field notes. Stratum 1 contained the large 7 by 14 meter square buildings with a small annex that represented the final phase of occupation. Stratum 2 was a hard, often replastered working floor, at least 120 meters square in dimension, that covered all of the lower strata and was the base of the foundation for the square building of Stratum 1. It was full of small pits. Together, we consider this to be architectural level 1. A similar building in square I-14 and the 2-room building with well-preserved ritual emplacement, M5, both discovered by georadar survey, were contemporaneous to this architectural 1. Stratum 3, architectural 2 in square K6 consisted of 2 buildings. One was a square building with a roof beam base and hearth along the western wall, and the other was a round building made of 2 courses of mud brick with a bench inside it. Both of these buildings appear to have been residential spaces. Each had large storage karaz vessels under their floors with stone coverings found in situ. Pat McGovern of the Penn Museum found residues possibly of resonated wine in one of the round buildings, along with evidence of a bearskin rug on the floor. Someone was living the good life. Stratum 4, architectural level 3, was a burn building. It had an auxiliary room with a ceramic hearth, or ojach, that apparently was ritually desacralized after the fire by cleaning it out and filling it with a number of centimeters of clean white plaster. The shape of the main building seems to have been square, but it is hard to tell for certain because the Yerevan Cultural Preserve would not permit us to remove any standing walls, and the remainder of the strata had to be dug inside the curve of the Stratum 3 round building wall. This limited the size of our sample of remains. In square J5, a 2-room building with a ritual emplacement apparently built in architectural 3, remodeled in architectural 2, was a precursor to the M5 ritual emplacement of architectural level 1. Helping to date it is a continuation of wall 5, of Stratum 5, just under the auxiliary room. Stratum 5, architectural level 4, consisted of 1 course building, a brick round building. By radiocarbon, it dates between 2874 and 2621 BC, more than 200 years before Stratum 1. The radiocarbon curve for the early third millennium is fairly flat, making precision difficult, unfortunately. The ancients rebuilt 4 round houses on the same spot, each with associated floors, but different brick sizes and construction. Stratum 6 and 7, architectural level 5, includes the second and third rebuildings of the roundhouse and an adjoining seemingly square building. Because of building 7, the square building, we consider these 2 strata as one architectural level. Stratum 8, architectural level 6, represents the first building at Shengavit. Resting on bedrock, building 7 was not built at this stratum. It includes the first construction of the roundhouse and small Pise semicircular bin, or I don't know, some sort of construction. So the earlier idea of there being 3 architectural levels did not fit our careful excavation with small picks and trowels. The excavation of square K6 indicates 8 identifiable strata and 6 separate architectural levels. Dating them stratigraphically and by use of absolute dates suggests that the founding of the site started after 2900 BC and its Kura-Araxes strata ended at about 2500 or 2450 BC. Stratum 0 pits date between 24 and 2200 BC, so within the early Kurgan. Does the pottery typology help in discriminating levels? We chose to build our typology first on functional variability. To avoid modern ethnocentric interference in this, we chose to characterize the forms as open, closed, and intermediate, although open forms certainly conform to generally to bowls and closed to a particular class of jars. In relative chronology terms, variations in pottery are not that sensitive to time, as this chart of the open category suggests. By taking time to measure in detail over 1,400 pots and sherds from only the best primary and secondary contexts, we could see how they varied over time. Most, in fact, were found throughout the occupation of Shengavit. A few variations were more limited in time. These raw data, along with pictures of the obverse and reverse of the sherds, will be available for free access on the Shengavit website on the TDAR web archive run by Arizona State University in due time. Taking the time to make these measurements, as boring as it was, is incredibly valuable. We've been able to answer questions about organization of pottery production, the social messaging of different designs, the technology of potting, by having a much more information than merely the typology. Oops. In fact, by comparing the distribution of types across the landscape, I've concluded that perhaps the treatment of the surfaces is more sensitive to cultural identity than change in the typological categories of shape. In regard to surface treatment, there were some noticeable changes at Shengavit. The earliest levels had very few of the complex incised design that typify Shengavit and related pottery styles. The highest percentage of pots was incised or raised with incised or raised design was by far in stratum 3, architectural level 2. Keep that in mind as we continue. Buff and black colored pots were common early in the site. In part, this may be a result of the smaller sample of strata 6 to 8. Interestingly enough, early Kurgan pots lacked complex incised design. Crosshatched triangles, common enough during the Kura-Araxes proper, did exist. Lacking particularly is the design associated with most of the ritual spaces. Complex designs had begun fading already in Shengavit stratum 1. Missing as well as designs on most of the tombs. See the Medallion et al. Catalog from 2015. Perhaps the messages that people would see and understand were not thought to be important in the grave. Maybe the focus was what the vessels contained for the funeral or for the use of the dead beyond their earthly existence. Aside from design, a notable change in the occurrence of different surfaces with greenish hue on an intermediate form with flaring rim appeared only in the last strata of Shengavit. This conference, however, is primarily about the transition from the Kura-Araxes to the early Kurgan period. Avatisian and Babochian write, quote, "Within the transition period, we see the degradation of the system of particularities typical of early groups, namely the breakdown of the elements of former system, diversity of cultural patterns, etc., and the appearance of new elements and parameters, most of which find their place in the system of the coming groups. Alternatively, Frangipani writes, when studying one of these obscure moments, it is crucial to try to understand the nature of what actually changed between the earlier and later phase. That is to say, to find out A, whether there were any real structural changes in the social and/or political organization of society and its internal and external relations. B, whether the transformations involve one or more than one, or every sphere of the community life. C, whether the innovations moved in the direction of the change that matured in the following phase, unquote. A transition of style is apparent at Shengavit. Excavators recovered a classic combed Bedeni pot in square M5 of the stratum 1. So this one down here in the corner. Ooh. Avatisi and Babachian assigned 2 Shengavit tombs to early Kurgan 1. However, as the slide shows, there are many long-lasting Kura-Araxes style pots in these tombs. 1 or 2 clearly post Kura-Araxes do exist, even if the characteristics and the shape seem to have been derived from Kura-Araxes' design repertoire. Gold objects, as you saw last lecture, did exist arguably in this transition period. You can see the post-Kura-Araxes shapes in pottery from Mark Topi and Bedeni images from Tony Sagona's publications. The question is, why particularly did this quote unquote foreign cone Bedeni style appear at this moment and in this locus? Does it indicate contact with different population or different exchange networks? As important as that the pottery per se may be an indicator that change happened, but it is the other side of culture with a capital C, the societal and organizational one, that we need to understand to explain how and why it changed. Kura-Araxes represents, as Areshian has argued, the real change that happened in the Ka2 in the Araxes River Basin. The number of Ka2 sites increased exponentially, although in discussing it with Steve Batiuk, we suspect that with a half a millennium of the Ka2, many of these very small sites were abandoned and others occupied. That is to say, the numbers are smaller than they appear in the maps. Perhaps their knowledge of fallowing or drainage led to the decline and fertility of their fields. Perhaps some changes in climate changed the ability to grow sufficient foods. Some sites like Shengavit grew in size from the 1 hectare settlements typical of the Ka1. More than physical growth, the functions of these centers of their still largely egalitarian settlement system grew. Apparently intensified agriculture filled the many, many grain storage pits at Shengavit. There appear to be too many of these for the settlement's population, even if they are storing surplus to prevent future food storage shortages. Presumably, those who controlled this grain had an advantage in an ability to feed workers whose efforts they coordinated. One thing they did, we now know, was to construct a massive settlement wall. For reasons mysterious to Hakob and me, some claim that the wall was not Kura-Araxes. Literally hot off the presses, we are presenting the proof that it was Kura-Araxes and when it was likely built. Hakob's team dug to the bottom of the wall near M5. The wall was laid on a pounded earth platform with mud brick reinforcements. The stone settlement wall was built up from the platform, first with 2 layers of large stones on the outside, joined together with clay mortar. These 2 constituent parts of the wall were erected almost simultaneously. First stones were laid out, and then a platform support was formed from wet clay. Later rectangular rooms made of mud bricks were built on this clay hard plastered surface. The base of the eastern wall is 50 centimeters higher than the base of the masonry of the stone wall. The base of another rectangular room, which is 2 meters west of the first wall, and is the eastern wall of the rectangular room, was 23 centimeters higher than the base of the settlement wall. Between these walls on a clay platform, they recovered artifacts of the Kura-Araxes period. The stones of the wall did not cut but they abutted the mud brick walls built on the pounded plaster platform. The georadar survey also suggested that the bottom of the wall was less than 2 meters from the surface. Putting these elements together, the wall was built in architectural level 2 or 3. So it had been built considerably after the stage of small round domed buildings, carbon dated 2874 to 2621, most likely somewhere between 2675 and 2600 BC, a couple of centuries after the founding of Shengavit and more than a century and a half before the site's final strata 1 and 2 architectural 1 was largely abandoned. Whether this wall was necessary for defense or as likely was a symbol and vehicle to establish the influence of a small group of kinsmen, it demonstrates the stress on new political and social institutions. The importance of the wall is not its size, but the coordination necessary to plan and build it, and the ability to recruit labor for a long and difficult task. It certainly shows them how to begin constructing a more ranked society. There would be no states or urban systems for more than a millennium in the South Caucasus. So what happened to cause this Kura-Araxes system to degrade is a big question for which we need a lot more information. It is reasonable to hypothesize that the agro-pastoral system was the foundation of Kura-Araxes society failed. The early Kurgan system emphasized mobility, more dependence on animals than crops, and violent competition. It therefore promoted new leadership systems dependent on the military leadership for competing groups, symbolized by the new Kurgan mortuary practices of these leaders, or perhaps as a symbol for the unity of the clans by focusing on the death of a leader each generation. The emphasis on chariots, carts, draft animals, metallurgy makes sense in this regard. These new institutions were not so strange to the developing rank of the last full-time residents of the Shengavit Center. What else could have caused such a rapid change? Was it disease? The Yamnaya have been shown to have suffered and spread bubonic plague. Was it their descendants who brought a crisis to the settled Kura-Araxes society, along with some new mortuary practices? Was it environmental, with too much intensity of crop production, as happened in the Ararat Valley at the end of the Ka-1? In the Ka-1, we have clear signs of salinization in the Ararat Valley. Was it a dialectical stresses of these new institutions could cope with peacefully? Was it what Solons and Service call the law of evolutionary potential? This quote unquote law states that if a society creates a system like the one we have now with our fossil fuel burning interdependent international trading networks, they rarely can step back or go forward without some radical changes. Frankly, we do not have enough data from the early Kurgan period to know. We certainly need a lot more of the settlement. They had to live somewhere. I do not believe the people of Shengavit disappeared. The continuing use of the site by early Kurgan people for burial, storage, and possibly short-term occupation indicates to me they had a continuing connection in memory. Thank you.